Imagine for a second that you're an alien historian looking down at Earth in the year 1860. You're placing bets on which civilization is going to dominate the planet for the next 2 centuries. You look at the British Empire. They literally own a quarter of the globe. You look at France, a cultural and military titan. You look at Russia, a sleeping giant. And then you look at the United States. What do you see? You see a fractured agrarian backwater that is currently tearing itself apart in the bloodiest civil war the world has arguably ever seen. Half the country is burning the other half down. Their currency is a mess. Their military is a joke compared to Prussia. If you put your money on the US in 1860, your alien bookie would have laughed in your face. But flash forward just 85 years. It's 1945. Europe is a smoking crater. The British Empire is liquidating its jewellery just to buy bread. Japan is ash. And the United States holds 50% of the world's GDP. It holds 80% of the world's gold reserves. It has a navy bigger than all other navies combined. How the hell did that happen? Standard high school history books will tell you it was because of freedom, democracy, and American exceptionalism. Bullshit. The real story involves geography that feels like a cheat code, ruthless war profiteering, a rigged financial system, and a level of geopolitical chess that makes Machiavelli look like a kindergarten teacher. Buckle up. We're going to deconstruct the American Empire. 1. The geographic cheat code, or how to play civilization on easy mode. Let's be honest, America didn't just get lucky, it won the cosmic lottery. Before we talk about banks, bombs, or politics, we have to talk about dirt and water. If you have ever played a strategy game like Civilization or Age of Empires, you know that your starting location dictates your success, and the United States started in the most broken, overpowered location on the map. The moats first. Look at the defense. The US is surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean on the right and the Pacific Ocean on the left. In military strategy, these are called moats. Massive, 3,000-mile-wide barriers that make a ground invasion of the US mainland logistically impossible. While France and Germany spent 1,000 years slaughtering each other because they share a flat border, the US has been able to develop its economy in near-total safety without having to spend 50% of its GDP on fortress walls. But here is the real kicker, the secret sauce that economists drool over, the Mississippi River Basin. This isn't just a river, it is the largest contiguous functionality of navigable waterways in the world. We are talking about 14,650 miles of waterways that you can float a barge down. Why does that matter? Because moving stuff by water is cheap, dirt cheap. Even today, moving cargo by water costs roughly $1.10 of what it costs to move it by truck, and about a third of what it costs by rail. In the 1800s and early 1900s, before the interstate highway system, this was the difference between poverty and wealth. A farmer in Iowa could float his corn down to New Orleans and ship it to the world for pennies. Meanwhile, a farmer in Russia or Brazil had to haul his crops over mountains or jagged terrain, making them too expensive to sell by the time they reached the port. This river system created an internal capital surplus that allowed the US to get rich before it even started trading heavily with the rest of the world. And then there's the land itself. The Midwest is the largest contiguous stretch of high-quality arable land on the planet. But it's not just food. The US is sitting on massive deposits of coal, iron, oil, and natural gas. Unlike Great Britain, which had to colonize half the world to get resources, or Japan, which had to invade China to get oil and rubber, the US had everything right there in its backyard. It didn't need an empire to survive. It was an empire in a box. Now, we have to address the elephant in the room. This land wasn't empty. This geographic advantage was secured through the systematic and brutal removal of Native American populations and a war of conquest against Mexico in 1846. The US government effectively seized the prime real estate of the continent through force. By 1900, the United States had achieved what geopolitical strategists call strategic depth. They had endless food, endless fuel, unassailable borders, and free transportation. While Europe was a crowded knife fight in a phone booth, America was sitting in a fortress built of gold. But having the resources is one thing. Turning that into global domination requires a crisis. And oh boy, did Europe deliver one. 2. The Merchant of Death, WWI and the Great Pivot. The year is 1914. Europe decides to commit collective suicide. This is World War I. Now, usually, when we hear about WWI, we hear about trenches, mustard gas, and the Franz Ferdinand assassination. But if you want to understand American power, you need to look at the ledgers. Before 1914, the United States was actually a debtor nation. That means American companies and the government owed more money to European investors, mostly the British and French, than Europeans owed to them. Wall Street was basically a junior branch office of the City of London. Then the shooting started. Great Britain and France needed stuff. A lot of stuff. They needed bullets, shells, rifles, wheat, cotton and steel. And because they were busy blowing up their own factories, they couldn't produce it themselves. So, they called up Uncle Sam. American exports to Europe skyrocketed. The US transformed into the factory of the world almost overnight. Check this out. In 1914, the value of US exports was roughly $2.4 billion. By 1916, that number hit $5.7 billion. Companies like DuPont, yes, the chemical guys, became absolute titans. During the war, DuPont produced 40% of the gunpowder used by the Allies. Their stock price went up by 355% during the war years. But here is where the real superpower mechanics kick in. Britain and France ran out of cash pretty quickly. They spent all their gold buying American explosive shells. So how do you pay for a war when you're broke? You borrow. Who did they borrow from? J.P. Morgan. The House of Morgan became the sole purchasing agent for the British Empire in the United States. They organised massive syndicates of American banks to lend billions of dollars to the Allies. By the time the war ended in 1918, the script had flipped. Europe owed the United States roughly $10 billion, which, adjusted for inflation to the size of the economy, is a staggering amount of money. New York had replaced London as the financial centre of the world. Now, you might be wondering, wait, didn't the US fight in the war? Yes, but barely. The US didn't officially enter the war until 1917, 3 years after it started. Think of it like a battle royale video game. The European powers spent 3 years bludgeoning each other, depleting their health bars, wasting their ammo, and destroying their economies. The US sat in the bushes, looting chests, upgrading its armour, and selling health potions to the fighters at a 500% markup. When the US finally stepped into the ring in 1917, it was fresh, rich, and industrialising faster than any nation in history. This massive influx of European wealth is what triggered the Roaring Twenties. That Great Gatsby lifestyle, that was funded by the interest payments from the British and French treasuries. But there was a dark side. The US was now the creditor to the world, but it refused to act like a leader. It demanded its war debts be paid, back in full, but it put up high tariffs, taxes, that made it impossible for Europe to sell goods to America to earn the money to pay those debts. This economic mismanagement helped lead to the Great Depression, and ultimately the rise of Hitler. But from a raw power perspective, the damage was done to Europe, and the torch had passed to Washington. However, the US wasn't a military superpower yet. In the 1930s, the US Army was roughly the size of Portugal's. It was tiny. To become the hegemon, America needed one more catastrophe, and history was about to provide the biggest one of all. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you want to survive the next economic collapse. Learning history is the best hedge fund. 3. The Arsenal of Democracy, WWII and the Industrial Explosion. If WWI was the warm-up, World War II was the main event. This is the moment the United States stopped being just a rich country and became a god-tier entity. The year is 1941. Hitler controls Europe. Japan is rampaging across the Pacific. The United States is still mostly asleep, shaking off the hangover of the Great Depression. Then Pearl Harbor happens. What followed was the greatest unleashing of industrial potential in the history of the human species. I want you to truly visualize these numbers because they don't feel real. President Franklin D. Roosevelt set targets that everyone thought were impossible. He demanded the production of 50,000 aircraft a year. His advisors told him it couldn't be done. By 1944, the US was producing 96,000 aircraft a year. Ford Motor Company, which used to make cars, built the Willow Run plant. This factory was a mile long. At its peak, it was churning out one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Imagine that. In the time it takes you to watch a couple of episodes of The Office, Ford had built a flying fortress capable of levelling a city. By the end of the war, the United States had produced 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2.6 million machine guns. Just like in WWI, the US supplied the Allies, Britain, the Soviet Union, China, with massive amounts of gear through a program called Lend-Lease. We sent $50 billion worth of supplies, about $700 billion today. We sent 400,000 jeeps and trucks to the Soviet Union alone. Russian dictator Joseph Stalin explicitly admitted later that without American machines, the USSR would have lost the war. But here is the cynical truth. Lend-Lease wasn't charity. It was leverage. By supplying the world, the US made the entire Allied war effort dependent on American factories. While American factories were running 24/7, glowing with efficiency, everyone else's factories were being bombed into rubble. The German industrial base? Destroyed. The Japanese industrial base? Incinerated. The British industrial base? Bankrupt and bombed. The Soviet industrial base? Ravaged by invasion. When the smoke cleared in 1945, the United States was the only major power left standing with its homeland intact. The US possessed 2/3 of the world's gold. The US produced 60% of the world's industrial output. The US was the only country with the bomb. The world had been leveled, and the United States was the construction company, the bank and the police force all rolled into one. But military dominance wasn't enough. They needed to make sure they stayed on top forever. They needed to rig the global economy. And that brings us to a boring little hotel in New Hampshire. 4. The dollar trap, Bretton Woods and the infinite money glitch. While the soldiers were still fighting in Normandy, the bankers were fighting in a fancy hotel in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods. The year is 1944. The outcome of the war is basically decided. The US invites 44 nations to this hotel to decide how the global economy is going to work after the dust settles. This was the ultimate power move. The British sent their intellectual heavyweight, John Maynard Keynes. He was the most famous economist in the world. He proposed a fair global currency called the Bancor that wouldn't favour any single country. The United States sent a guy named Harry Dexter White. White basically looked at Keynes and said, "That's a cute idea, John, but we have all the gold, so we're doing it my way." And his way was the Bretton Woods Agreement. Here is how it worked. The US dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. Every other currency in the world, the pound, the franc, the lira, would be pegged to the US dollar. Do you realise what this means? It made the US dollar the official global reserve currency. If France wanted to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, they couldn't pay in francs. The Saudis didn't want francs, they wanted dollars. This gave the United States an exorbitant privilege. The US could print pieces of green paper to buy real stuff. Cars, electronics, oil from the rest of the world. Every other country had to actually make things and sell them to earn those dollars. It was like showing up to a casino where you're the only person allowed to print your own chips in the bathroom. To enforce this system, they created 2 organisations, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. Officially, these exist to help stabilise the global economy. Unofficially, they were designed to ensure that the Global South remained open to American business and that Western Europe stayed addicted to American loans. The trap was set. The world was now financially hooked on Washington, but Europe was still a pile of rubble, and a pile of rubble doesn't buy many Fords or Coca-Colas. 5. The Marshall Plan, buying loyalty. By 1947, Europe was starving, literally. People were eating tulip bulbs in the Netherlands, and in this desperation, a new threat was rising: communism. Stalin and the Soviet Union were looking at Western Europe and thinking, hey, these guys are broke and angry. Perfect time for a revolution. Communist parties in France and Italy were winning massive support. The US panicked. If Europe went red, the US would lose its biggest export market and its geopolitical buffer. Enter Secretary of State George Marshall. He proposed the Marshall Plan. The US gave Western Europe $13 billion, about $150 billion today, in aid to rebuild their cities and factories. The catch? There's always a catch. History books frame this as a great act of charity. Look how nice America is. But let's look closer. This wasn't a bag of cash dropped from a helicopter. The money came with strings attached. A huge chunk of the aid credits had to be used to buy goods from the United States. It was a brilliant money laundering scheme for the US economy. The US government taxes American citizens. They give that money to France. France uses that money to buy tractors from US corporations. The money comes right back to American businesses. It was a stimulus check for General Motors and US Steel, disguised as foreign aid. More importantly, it bought loyalty. By taking the money, Western European nations agreed to align their trade policies with the US and keep the communists out of power. It cemented the divide between East and West. The Iron Curtain slammed shut, and the US owned the western half. By the way, if you're enjoying this deconstruction of the American empire, hit that like button. It helps the algorithm know you prefer hard truths over fairy tales. 6. The military-industrial complex, the forever war. So, the Nazis are gone. Peace on earth, right? Wrong. The United States had a problem. Their entire economy had been built around war production. If they stopped building tanks and bombers, the Great Depression might come back. They needed a reason to keep the factories running. Fortunately, the Soviet Union was the perfect villain. In 1950, a secret government paper called NSC 68 was drafted. It argued that the US needed to maintain a massive military build-up indefinitely to contain communism. This was the birth of the permanent war economy. This created a self-sustaining cycle known as the Iron Triangle. The military wants new toys. Defense contractors, Lockheed, Boeing, Raytheon, want profitable contracts. Politicians want jobs for their districts to get re-elected. So the contractors lobby the politicians. The politicians fund the military. The military buys from the contractors. Everyone gets rich except the taxpayer. This got so out of hand that in 1961, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a five-star general and war hero, used his farewell address to warn the country. He said, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex." He was basically saying, guys, we have created a monster that feeds on conflict. If we aren't careful, it will look for wars just to eat. But here is the edgy twist. This monster actually built the modern world. To keep ahead of the Soviets, the US government poured trillions into R&D, research and development. Need to communicate during a nuclear war? The internet, ARPANET. Need to guide missiles precisely? GPS. Need smaller guidance computers? Microchips. Need lighter aircraft materials? Jet engines and advanced plastics. Silicon Valley didn't start with two guys in a garage. It started with massive Department of Defense contracts. Your iPhone exists because the US wanted to blow up Moscow more efficiently than Moscow could blow up Washington. The US became a superpower not just by outgunning the world, but by out-inventing it, using the military budget as a massive hidden industrial policy. But by the 1970s, the gold part of the golden age was running out. The rest of the world was catching up. The US was losing the Vietnam War, and the dollar was in trouble. America needed a pivot. It needed to change the rules of the game again. And this time, the target wasn't Europe, it was the Middle East. 7. The petrodollar pivot, the ultimate rug pull, 1971-1974. Remember earlier when we said the US dollar was backed by gold? Well, by 1971, that system was failing. Countries like France were getting suspicious. They looked at all the money the US was printing to pay for the Vietnam War and said, "You guys don't have enough gold in the vault to back this up." So, France demanded to cash in their dollars for physical gold bars. The US gold reserves started draining like a bathtub with the plug pulled out. If this continued, the US would go broke. So on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on TV and effectively said, "Psych, we aren't giving you gold anymore." This was the Nixon shock. He unilaterally cancelled the direct convertibility of the US dollar to gold. Overnight, the US dollar became a fiat currency, backed by nothing but faith and credit. The value of the dollar started to plummet. The superpower status was shaky. They needed a new anchor. If money wasn't backed by gold, what is the one thing the entire world needs even more than gold? Energy. In 1974, the US sent Treasury Secretary William Simon to Saudi Arabia with a very specific mission. It was a gangster move of the highest order. The deal: the US promises to protect the House of Saud militarily. We will sell you F-15s, tanks, and guard your oil fields forever. In exchange, Saudi Arabia must price all of its oil sales exclusively in US dollars. Saudi Arabia must take their surplus oil profits and invest them back into US Treasury bonds, basically lending the money back to America. This is the birth of the petrodollar. This changed the physics of the global economy. Since Saudi Arabia dominated the oil market, OPEC, everyone else followed suit. If you are Japan and you need oil, you have to buy US dollars first. If you are Brazil and you need oil, you have to buy US dollars first. This created a perpetual artificial demand for the US dollar. It meant the United States could run massive deficits, print endless amounts of money, and buy cheap goods from China, and the dollar wouldn't collapse, because the world needed dollars to keep the lights on. While other countries have to worry about their trade balance, the US can write a check that never bounces because it owns the bank and the gas station. 8. Soft power. Weaponized blue jeans. While the bankers were locking down the oil, the US unleashed a weapon that the Soviet Union had no defense against. It wasn't a missile, it was MTV. Political scientist Joseph Nye calls this soft power. Hard power is forcing someone to do what you want with a gun. Soft power is making them want what you want. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union had more tanks. They arguably had better rockets for a while, but their life looked miserable. Grey concrete buildings, bread lines, terrible shoes. Meanwhile, the US was beaming images of Baywatch, Coca-Cola, Levi's, and rock and roll across the Iron Curtain. You cannot underestimate how important this was. There is a famous story about Levi's 501 jeans in the Soviet Union. They were illegal to import. On the black market, a pair of American jeans cost a month's salary. Why? Because wearing them meant you were free. You were cool. You were American. The CIA actually understood this. They covertly funded tours for American jazz musicians and abstract expressionist painters to go to Europe. The message was, look how creative and free we are. Over in Russia, the government tells you what to paint. Here you can do whatever you want. In 1990, the first McDonald's opened in Moscow. Thousands of Russians stood in line for hours in the freezing cold. Not just for a Big Mac, but for a taste of the American dream. By exporting its culture, the US colonized the minds of the world. Before a US soldier ever sets foot in a country, the kids there are already watching Marvel movies, listening to Taylor Swift and using iPhones. It makes it very hard for a foreign government to hate America when their own population is addicted to American culture. The US didn't just conquer land, it conquered the cool. 9. The tech monopolies, the digital empire, 1990s, present. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The US declared victory, but history didn't end. The battlefield just moved to a new dimension, cyberspace. Remember earlier when I said the military invented the internet? Well, in the 90s they handed it over to the private sector, and the US managed to capture the digital high ground before anyone else even realized there was a hill to climb, the platform economy. Look at the internet today. Who owns it? Search, Google, American. Social media, Meta, Facebook, American. Business OS, Microsoft, American. Smartphones, Apple, American. Cloud infrastructure, Amazon AWS, American. These aren't just companies, they are the infrastructure of modern life. If you are a German startup, you run on Amazon servers. If you are a Brazilian influencer, you live on Instagram. This gives the United States an intelligence advantage that is terrifying. Through programs like PRISM, revealed by Edward Snowden, the US intelligence agencies technically have backdoor access to the data flowing through these massive platforms. While China has tried to build its own walled garden, the Great Firewall, with Alibaba and WeChat, the rest of the world effectively lives in a digital colony of the United States. Data is the new oil, and just like in 1974, the US controls the pipelines. 10. The Great Unraveling, the debt and the challenges. So we've established that America is playing with a stacked deck. It has the land, the money printer, the military, and the internet. But here is the twist ending. The house of cards is shaking. If you look at the data right now, the United States is facing 3 existential threats that geography and aircraft carriers can't fix. Threat number 1, the debt spiral. Remember the infinite money glitch we talked about? Well, it turns out infinite has limits. The US national debt is currently over $34 trillion. That number is so big the human brain can't process it. But here is a stat that will keep you awake at night. As of 2024, the US government spends more money on interest payments for its debt than it spends on the entire defense budget. Let that sink in. We are spending more to pay off yesterday's credit card bills than we are on the military that secures the empire. If the world ever stops trusting the dollar, that debt becomes a suicide vest. Threat number 2. Weaponizing the dollar. The sanctions backfire. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the US did something unprecedented. It froze hundreds of billions of dollars of Russia's reserves. It kicked them out of the SWIFT banking system. It was supposed to be a financial nuke. But it had an unintended side effect. Every other country, China, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, India, watched that happen and thought, whoa, if Washington gets mad at us, they can delete our money overnight. This fear kick-started the de-dollarization trend. We are seeing the rise of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now others. They are actively building alternative payment systems to bypass the dollar. Saudi Arabia is even talking about selling oil in Chinese yuan. If the petro-yuan becomes a real thing, the petrodollar dies, and with it the American privilege of printing cheap money. Threat number 3. The empire within. Finally, the biggest threat isn't in Beijing or Moscow, it's in Washington. The internal polarization in the US is at levels not seen since the Civil War, where we started this video. A superpower can survive external enemies. It cannot survive when half the crew tries to sink the ship because they hate the captain. Final thoughts. The fragile titan. So, how did America become a superpower? It wasn't magic. It was a combination of 1. Geography, the best real estate on Earth. 2. Opportunity, getting rich while Europe burned in 2 world wars. 3. Strategy, rigging the global financial system, Bretton Woods and Petrodollar. 4. Innovation, using the military to build the digital age. The United States didn't just win the game, it bought the casino, wrote the rulebook, and hired the bouncers. But history has a brutal rule: reversion to the mean. No empire lasts forever. The British thought the sun would never set. The Romans thought they were eternal. The United States has had an incredible 80-year run as the undisputed king of the hill. But the world is changing. The map is being redrawn. The question isn't, how did America become a superpower? The real question you should be asking today is, what happens to the world when it isn't? If you want to survive the geopolitical shifts coming in the next decade, you need to pay attention. We're going to be covering the rise of the Global South and the AI revolution in upcoming videos. Do you think the US dollar will lose its reserve status in our lifetime? Or is the American system too big to fail? Let me know in the comments below. I read the ones that don't look like bots. If you learned something new today, destroy that like button like it's the Berlin Wall, and hit subscribe to join us for the next deep dive. Thanks for watching. Stay curious.